Next to the emergency room stood cars riddled with bullets from which blood was flowing. They were all civilians, because the number of patients was arriving at such a pace, and the parents simply laid down on top of him. They both died. There were those who arrived dead or those who died on the way. Those who survived reached the hospital. And they heard all this, they heard it. And the terrorists stormed the medical station. They killed all the wounded they were treating. This is not Islam. This is not us. There's some completely different people. It was perhaps even a hunt, human hunt, Dr. Vadim Benkovich, Soroka Hospital. Vadim, you are the head orthopedic doctor at Soroka Hospital. That's correct. You were probably among the first, your department, your colleagues, to start receiving the wounded on October 7th. That's correct. The morning of October 7th. Where did it find you? And what was the timeline of that day? Can you share even that entire day? How did your day unfold? As you remember, it was a Saturday, it was a holiday. In the department, there was no one aside from the on-call team. And essentially, the doctors who were on duty were the first ones to encounter the first patients. Because the first patients were not brought in by ambulances, not by any official means of patient transport. They were brought in by ordinary citizens who either witnessed or were even victims of this attack. In a parking lot next to the emergency room stood cars riddled with bullets from which blood was flowing. Because the wounded were brought as they were by whoever could. And even as you approached the hospital, you understood something terrible had happened. And especially that morning when it all began, where were you? How did your day? I wasn't in a hospital. I was called at 6:30 and they said, like all normal people, I was sleeping that day. And essentially, most of the doctors were not in the hospital or in the department. And people started to come in. But the scale of this tragedy and all the horror was so difficult to grasp, even from the reports. My wife, who works at Soroka, works in radiology. She arrived at the department before me and at the hospital, and she couldn't grasp it either. It was clear that something horrible was happening, because the number of patients was arriving at such a pace that Soroka Hospital had never known before. And I can already say in advance that now we know that such a number of seriously wounded and wounded in general at such a pace, in such concentration. To this day, no hospital in the Western world has dealt with such a mass inflow of wounded people. Just as an example, I'll tell you that in the first 16 hours, the hospital received about 700 wounded. Among them were many in serious condition. There was even a period, as recorded by the patient registration system, that in an hour and a quarter, there was a period where every minute a patient arrived. That is, in the first 60 minutes of that period, 60 patients arrived. Just to explain the scale of this tragedy compared to anything else that had happened before and described in our literature, in the professional literature, among cases of such large-scale mass arrivals of patients. The closest was the Boston Marathon, where there were 215 wounded at once that were distributed amongst 4 hospitals. 4 large Boston hospitals, so that the first 700 wounded who arrived at Soroka were not comparable to anything else. Most of them were, of course, orthopedic. And again, I can say in advance that today, after nearly a year of ongoing war, Soroka has received around 4,000 wounded, civilians and military, mostly civilians. At least in the beginning, amongst whom over 80% were orthopedic patients. That is mostly limb and other orthopedic injuries. And on the first day, in those first minutes, the patients who were arriving, were they civilians? The first patients were young people from the festival. And after them, in the following hours, residents of the area surrounding Gaza started arriving. People from the kibbutzim located right near Gaza. And that, of course, intensified the feeling of the horror of what happened. Because not only did the people have completely unbelievable injuries, it was absolutely clear, even to someone with no connection to the military injuries, that they had been shot at point-blank range. People had their limbs shattered. You could often tell the goal was not to kill, but to torture them, because they were shot in the limbs with large caliber weapons. I mean a large caliber Kalashnikov. You mean in the legs, the arms? In the legs, the arms. Patients arrived without limbs. They had been blown off by those very same shots. These details might be unpleasant to hear for people who don't deal with this field or haven't experienced this tragedy firsthand. But this is a very important detail because we immediately understood that there was murder being committed. This wasn't a battle, it wasn't collateral damage. This was a deliberate intent to kill through torture as many people as possible. It was obvious that were being abused, obvious that the survivors were tortured and shot at point blank. Often after already having been wounded and laying on the ground. I'm only speaking about those who were brought to us alive. There were also those brought in dead or who died en route. And when did you personally arrive at the hospital? I didn't come right away. It took me time to get to the hospital, like it did for anyone else who was far from the hospital that day. But the department kept working at the same pace. The department and the whole hospital, even the non-surgical department, the internal medicine department, quickly reorganized. It was clear we couldn't house all the surgical, all the trauma patients in just orthopedics or surgery departments. So the internal medicine wards were cleared to create space for patients' hospitalization. Operating rooms worked non-stop 24 hours a day. Many operating rooms. For the first few days, people refused to leave even once the option became available. I'm talking about doctors and hospital staff. By the third day, I was struggling to persuade people to take a break, because it was clear that they would be needed later on. So everyone basically stayed at the hospital. Everyone slept at the hospital. And no one, they slept for 15-20 minutes when possible. Our department, at least during the first few weeks, had 4 operating rooms working 24 hours a day, without a break. The tragedies coming in gave us no chance to stop or time to think about anything else. And on top of that, there were human dramas unfolding. In one room, we tried to save a young man whose leg had essentially been blown off. He arrived with an amputated leg. You could call it a gunshot amputation, a traumatic one. And in the adjacent room, they amputated the leg of his fiancée. So they were together. By the way, they later got married. That might be a somewhat brighter continuation of the story. And these guys from the festival? From the festival. Share your feeling from the first hours, minutes. What did you know about what had happened? What information reached you in the morning, during the day? And when did you realize, fully understand what actually had happened? I mean, from the very start, what did you think? What were you told? What happened? Like, look, those nurses and doctors and hospital staff who live close to the hospital, that's the majority. Everyone understood what was going on to a greater or lesser degree. And because Beersheba and all the surrounding areas were being bombed, that is, to get to the hospital without having to pull off to the side of the road and lay down on the ground was impossible because rockets were falling directly on Beersheba. Everyone understood that some kind of war had started. Understanding what was actually happening at the festival and nearby was very difficult. If you remember, even in the press and official news, the reports of deaths started with a few dozen. Then within the next few days it reached 100, then 300. I remember the exact chronology, but that nearly 1,500 civilians had been killed. I emphasize those were civilians. This became known only, if I'm not mistaken, almost a week later, so even in the hospital itself, it was very hard to understand how many patients had arrived, because the departments were divided into groups. And each group handled a specific patient. He would be taken to the operating room, and generally to the people in the operating rooms it was not always clear what was happening in the ER. Of course, those in the ER, those who handled the first wave of patients, understood that something unimaginable was happening, but still fully understanding the scale was difficult. Meanwhile, my eldest son, who was on vacation in a hotel in the south, called and said he had received a call-up order for reserve duty. And had just informed me that he was heading home with his wife, and asked me how to get there. I didn't understand the question. What do you mean, how to get there? Get in the car and drive. But he had to drop his wife off at home and then continue on to the army. And only later I did realize that he already knew that not all the roads from Mitzpei Ramon to Beersheba were open. And I still didn't understand that. I didn't understand that the terrorists were on the roads just shooting people. And when did you learn that information about the terrorists? I assume that as a medical professional, the police or the army must have started telling you something about what was going on. What information came in regarding that, and when did it reach you? That the terrorists had broken in and were simply shooting people. This became clear fairly quickly. But for us, the people who were treating the injured in the first few days, we didn't have time to watch the news. We didn't have time to get any information, so to speak, from any official sources. Perhaps the main source of information were the people who were evacuated to us. Young guys from the festival came in first, then residents of the kibbutz, who said that after having been injured, they couldn't be pulled out of the meat grinder for 8, 10, 12 hours. I knew a family who sat in the protective room for 24 hours trying to defend themselves. They were shot at through the metal doors, got hit, and the father of the family was killed. He died in front of his 3 children, and the desperate mother pushed them out through the armored window. She opened the window from the inside, pushed them out, climbed out herself, and they just ran away, not understanding that what was happening outside their house. The father of the family stayed behind. He died in front of the children. These stories, for me, as a grandson of a Holocaust survivor, I know perhaps only from my grandmother's account or from literature that described those episodes, where the people fled into unknown or saw entire families destroyed in front of their eyes, families about whom no one will ever tell. because there were no witnesses left to what happened there. Mostly these were kibbutz residents. As for what happened at the festival, those people weren't ready to immediately share their feelings. Which is understandable. People were in shock, in a state of shock, sometimes simply in a physical condition that didn't allow sharing about these topics. It was hard for us to grasp the scale, hard to know when this wave would end, the wave of arrivals. And with every passing minute, it became more and more clear that something terrible was happening. Were the children brought to you? Yes, children were brought to us, mostly these children from the communities surrounding Gaza. Kibbutzim, yes, kibbutzim, Be'eri, Nir Oz. I don't remember exactly from which kibbutz, but there was a boy, one of the more difficult stories, who was brought to us. He had an abdominal wound. He underwent surgery. Then during the first resuscitation measures, when his condition stabilized a little, turned out that he also had a leg wound that also required surgery, but since it was no longer life-threatening, someone had to sign. He was a minor, so a parent had to sign a consent. We spoke with him. It turned out that both of his parents had died. Their window, the armored window, was destroyed, likely with an anti-tank rifle, and several grenades were thrown into that room. And the parents simply laid down on top of him. They both died, and he lay under the bodies of his parents for 8 hours. At some point, he tried to contact his relatives by phone, and even the relatives didn't understand him. They thought it was some kind of stupid joke or strange prank. They didn't immediately realize that the child was simply writing the truth. He was afraid to speak because he didn't know how far the terrorists had gone, and he lay wounded in the abdomen and in the leg under the bodies of his parents for 8 hours. And he survived. He didn't bleed to death. He survived. Fortunately, the injuries weren't very serious, thanks to the fact that his parents actually shielded him with their own bodies. And it was very, very dramatic. That is, for me, someone who served in the army and worked at Soroka. I've been working at Soroka for the past 35 years. We've been through more than one war. I've been in these wars from different sides, both on this side of the border and the other. As a doctor, as a reservist. And I don't remember such horrifying stories. How old is that child? The boy was 14 years old. There was a girl about 11 years old who saw her mother killed before her eyes, just shot point blank. She saw it happen. She herself wasn't killed. Or maybe they missed. Hard to tell. And she was brought to us with a light injury as well. But a child at 11 years old saw her mother being killed. That is a very difficult experience. Even just hearing it from a child is a very difficult experience. Did the children tell these stories themselves? They did. They were immediately surrounded with professional help. There were psychologists, there were social workers. We didn't ask them any questions. We did our job. But still, fragments of those stories reached us over the next few days. It was all horrible. These were all civilians? Absolutely civilians, people without any... Like those guys, the boys and girls at the festival, and those children in the kibbutz. For those who also understand the political landscape in Israel, well, The people living on the Gaza border were always very optimistic about Arab-Israeli relations. These were always people of a left-leaning political outlook. Let's put it this way, for them it was an ever bigger shock, because some of their parents and neighbors used to help residents of Gaza. Many of them were transporting them for treatment and so on. So let's put it this way, for them, it was a more unpleasant surprise than for people who were of a different political outlook. Yes, I was told in one of the interviews, we had a guest, Edward Stern, a photographer. In the first few days, he was documenting everything with the army and special forces, everything that took place in the kibbutz. He was there with many teams, and for 3 weeks, he wanted to quit on the second day. It was very hard. He still hasn't watched his own interview. It was too difficult for him. By the way, that restricted film, the one banned from public viewing, many of his works are there. And he shared stories. You spoke about the grenades. He talked about it a lot. They were shooting RPGs through grenades into children's bedrooms. He saw it all. Everything was there. It happened, yes. And what I didn't know, and you're talking about it now, that those who ran in from Gaza, what were they called again? Residents in slippers, yes, along those lines. Those who were mostly people who had been working in those kibbutzim for 20-25 years. The ones we fed, so to speak, who were given jobs, money. They were the first ones to go into the houses they worked in to murder. This is to say, they were spotters essentially because they had many maps on them. Those were the people who worked there. Many of those who worked in the kibbutzim knew exactly who lived there. They knew the addresses, they knew where the weapons might be stored in a home. Exactly, they knew where the officers might be, especially the security squad. Each kibbutz has a self-defense unit. They knew who lived in which house. They knew where the command post was in each kibbutz, where the vests and the helmets were. They knew everything perfectly well. So what you're talking about is those very people that are mainly defending. In the end, look how it turned out for us. Vadim, here's a question. If you can answer, great. If not, that's fine too. How many people died on the way or already in the hospital, those who went through all this? Our people. That's very hard for me to say because I'm not sure that kind of statistics exist. Some people were brought to the hospital already dead, and that happened a lot. They brought people who may have died on the spot, but those who collected them didn't know that. They didn't have sufficient medical training. Relatively few died after arriving due to blood loss or injuries incompatible with life. And initially, was the hospital even ready for such an influx of wounded patients? Absolutely not. No hospital is prepared for this. There is a concept as maximum hospital capacity. I might be struggling to find an exact term in Russian, but when the hospital systems, even those, let's say, doctors who are at home, who are supposed to arrive in case of an extraordinary situation. Such a situation would be considered in case of 8 simultaneously admitted patients or higher, whether it's a military event or some kind of accident. That is, an emergency situation is declared. Our hospital, perhaps in a worst-case scenario, we plan for 60 to 100 per day, simultaneously from a single event, let's say. That had never happened. The previous war in Gaza, Protective Edge, throughout its almost 2 months' duration, we received the same number of patients as on the first day of this war. So the proportions are completely incomparable, and one could have expected that the entire life support system, all of the hospital infrastructure would collapse under such overload, but that did not happen. Operating rooms were opened in places that didn't have them before. Additional diagnostic stations were opened. Extra CTs that weren't in close proximity to the ER, the emergency room. And definitely today we can say that was a horrible experience. But the hospital endured it with honor, with high professionalism. That is, they managed. Doctors were found who, absolutely, doctors arrived well to explain how this was happening. Besides, those doctors who weren't at the hospital, and of course everyone came as soon as they could, doctors also arrived from other hospitals. People who had recently retired and weren't working, they returned. Several doctors from my department who were on long-term internships in Canada and the US simply got on a plane and came. They didn't fly on the first day, of course, but I was speaking with them. At some point, I even said, you know, we already have a sufficient number of doctors. Colleagues from other hospitals came. There was not a single head of Orthopedic Department in Israel, up to the very north, that didn't call me to ask how they could help. So everyone was willing to help. Yes, everyone came. People showed up in the department whom I had never met. People came and introduced themselves. I'm doctor from such and such. I'm doctor from such and such. Please put me to good use. As one of my colleagues said to me, whom I had said, actually, maybe there is no longer a need for that. He said he was in Canada, in Toronto, and he told me it doesn't matter. I've already bought a ticket. I'm flying out. If you don't need me as a doctor, I'll be a hospital orderly, no problem. How long did such a flow of patients continue? A day, 2 days? Did it continue like that? The first 2 days were the most intense. Naturally, the first 16 hours were the most intense. That is, their very relatives were bringing them, the residents. Yes. On the second day, more or less, there is always a question being asked, why were they all brought to Soroka? It wasn't regulated by the Ministry of Health, nor by the Home Front Command, nor by anyone else. People just got in their cars and drove to the nearest hospital. There were no coordinators. On the following day, when the Home Front Command got involved, patients began to be distributed. And when those emergency services that were evacuating the wounded directly from the epicenter of the events got involved, they, of course, started distributing them more evenly to other hospitals. Again, those who could be transported or flown, those who could tolerate longer distances. So I'm correct in understanding that in your and your colleagues' estimation, they mostly aimed at the limbs? That was a deliberate approach? Perhaps partially. At the festival it was like that. At the festival specifically, at the legs and the arms. But partly we must recognize that people who were shot in the chest and the abdomen and in the head simply didn't make it to us. So the terrorists were shooting into the crowd. They were shooting. Those who survived said it was essentially... In fact, there's also video documentation that was preserved. It might even have been a hunt. They chased them down, pursued them, they searched for them in ditches. Those who managed, even while wounded, to crawl there to hide. People tried to crawl under cars, under some at bus stations that were shelters for protection from rocket attacks. People hid there, and there the grenades were thrown into them. Clearly, only those who survived made it to the hospital. Look, we had a Russian-speaking man in the hospital. Apparently, he hadn't been in the country for long. because I couldn't even ask him how long, as his Hebrew wasn't very good. He managed to save his wife. His wife was in 9 months of pregnancy.
If I'm not mistaken, she gave birth either on the 7th or the 8th after arriving at the hospital. He was wounded.
He was in orthopedics, his wife was in the maternity ward. And he saved her while wounded, pulled her out. Somehow they managed to escape. I don't remember the exact details, either in their own car or someone helped them. And that horror in their eyes of the man who saw that they were shot at a point-blank range. Sometimes people said they were likely left behind because the terrorists were certain that they were dead. They were shot, fell down, and the terrorists moved on. They passed by either on foot or by car. And even from those accounts, I wasn't physically present at the scenes. But based on those accounts, it was clear that this was some kind of unimaginable sadism, a bloodlust that is hard to grasp or describe. What drives these people who shoot children? We heard different stories about infants murdered before their parents' eyes, then parents were murdered, and so on. It's some kind of a cannibalism we apparently had never encountered before. Again, in that classified film that is not allowed for public viewings, honestly, I saw only a small part. Watching it until the end is impossible. I'll say this right away. What caught my eye was that all these atrocities from body cams, surveillance cameras, those were atrocities, not just shootings. I don't even want to say it out loud. Did you have patients who were witnesses to these specific atrocities? Or generally, did none of those near the atrocities survive? Well, of course, there were people who saw their entire families killed. They were wounded, and everything they heard when they regained consciousness in intensive care after surgery was that nothing was left of their family. We had to work with those people too. We had to give them some optimism, some kind of hope. Since I myself live very close to Soroka, my children who grew up there, my 4 children, had friends who died. Some at the festival, some while serving in the army, some were in the area. And let's put it this way, even my youngest child, who was 19 years old at the time, the number of funerals he attended was disproportionate to his age or to any kind of expectation. There were his classmates and kids from a parallel class and just neighbors from our street. As for the military personnel, the non-civilians, we had female observers killed and wounded. Did they also come to you? In most places where the terrorists stormed the bases, they simply murdered everyone. Those they didn't murder, they took hostage. My children had friends who were simply taken into Gaza. And 2 of them, as it became clear a few months later, had perished. Those were the ones taken hostage. Among those taken hostage, it was clear about one of them that he had perished, even though his body hadn't been found. It was found, I believe, only 10 months later. One was alive, we know he was alive, and maybe not even wounded when he was kidnapped. But he was found dead quite recently, including a classmate of one of my children. So all of this happened close by. Living in Israel, a small country, especially in the south, in the areas where we live, where my kids finished school, where they went to some after-school activities, it turned out that somehow all of us were affected. Today, there is no one who doesn't know someone or knows someone. This is too small of a country, too many murdered and wounded. Your children, if I understood correctly, are they still serving? Are they in Gaza or in the north? 3 of my children were. One was doing mandatory service. That Saturday, he had the day off. He was home. At 7 a.m., his commanders called up. He went to the base.
And he's still there since the war began, a whole year at this point?
He's still there. He was there even before. He's doing mandatory service. So he's still there. Now the whole division had been transferred to the north. My eldest son, although he's a doctor, was called up as a reservist, as a soldier in his unit. And he was also in Gaza. He was recently discharged from the reserve duty and returned to his department in orthopedics in another hospital. And the middle son was not called up. The middle son was studying abroad. He dropped out because his friends were called up. He couldn't stay there. He dropped out and returned. The only thing I know for sure is that I, as someone who grew up on stories of pogroms, my grandfather, who is no longer with us, told me about the pogroms in Ukraine at the beginning of the last century. My grandmother told me about the entire family the Nazis killed in Chernihiv. I grew up on stories of terrible things, including literature every Soviet boy would come across. And I'm certain that what my children were doing, they were fighting Nazism that has reached our time. They were fighting fascism that took on different forms, but it's the same. They were fighting against absolute evil. This is absolute evil. I looked into the eyes of that absolute evil. I saw and heard things I thought I'd never hear. Always, I don't know. People often draw a line between soldiers and civilians in Israel who suffered more. I think there were times, like in the Soviet Union during the World War II, when there was no red line between front and rear. Everything was serving victory, all for victory, all for defeating this absolute evil. So when we talk about our soldiers, many of them, including my children, are civilians. They didn't want to fight, they weren't planning to, they weren't seeking this war. This war came to us, it broke in. We weren't expecting it. And we had to defend our home. We're fighting for our home. Keep in mind, when we talk about civilian professions, peaceful people, in Soroka, 2 doctors were murdered. 2 doctors, one of them was in kibbutz Be'eri. He was supposed to have been on duty, and around 7 a.m. he was supposed to head to the hospital for his shift. But he called and said he couldn't come because wounded were arriving, and he was providing first aid at the clinic of kibbutz Be'eri to those wounded, along with a paramedic girl, whom one of my sons, also a paramedic, knew. The terrorists burst into the medical station. They murdered all the wounded they had found. They shot the doctor. They shot the paramedic girl. She was wounded and managed to call home and talk to her parents, and she managed to give herself first aid. They shot her in the legs. She applied a bandage, stopped the bleeding. They returned to the clinic and finished her off. And all of this happened live while she was talking to her parents. They heard it all. They heard it. Speaking about the division between civilians and non-civilians, one of the pediatric intensive care doctors who on October 7th was working in the emergency room and admitting the wounded the same day was called up to the army as a doctor to help out soldiers. And that same evening, he perished. Wonderful people, wonderful doctors who were not seeking war, did not love war, and treated everyone. They treated children brought in from Gaza, they treated the wounded in their wars. They also have their own wars inside Gaza, between clans. And they all came to us. They came to us because of accidents, for various reasons. And those doctors who provided them care were shot by those very people, by those people. Yes, by those people. They were shooting point blank, knowing they were entering a medical station, knowing these were doctors and paramedics. The girl was wearing a paramedic jacket, and it was a medical station, and they were providing aid. They weren't armed. So the fact that this is true evil, evil in its absolute expression, there should be no doubt about it. In my department, there are doctors, Israeli, Arabs, from Negev, from the north. They all worked on October 7th. They came, some of them came under rocket fire because they knew their help was needed. I spoke with one of them 3 days later and urged him to go home and rest. He said he was still able to work. He would stay and work. And all of them, without exception, among them are believers, people who practice Islam. All of them at one point or another, each in their own way, told me, this is not Islam, this is not us. These are some other people. This was to emphasize their lack of solidarity with any narrative that tries to suggest that this is the war of civilizations or religions, a religious war. This is a war between good and evil. This is absolute evil against absolute good. Human hunt.